This is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
This season is about discussing the various things I've done and continue to do to heal from the trauma and reprogram all these various behaviors, like the codependency that we talked about in the first season.
The things we're going to explore the next few episodes aren't in any kind of chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this isn't a program for how you remake a codependent mind. We didn't discover all these things beforehand, but these are the major themes that emerged.
Right, the takeaways. It really has not been an easy process for either one of us. It was a lot of times haphazard with these kind of false starts or going down the wrong roads partially and having to course correct. And all that said, I mean, an urgent thing that I had to start being able to do was to learn to start incorporating my emotions, finally. To recognize what they are, how to use them properly. I just wasn't doing that for most of my life, and it was pretty much at the root of what was keeping me stuck with all these problems.
And it was equally important to be able to recognize the source of your trauma and the effects that it had, one of which, a huge one, was this emotional disconnect and deregulation.
Yeah.
So those two really go hand in hand.
Yeah, I kind of had to address them both simultaneously.
And as we covered extensively in the first season, the source of that trauma was originally this abusive friendship, childhood friendship, with a boy we called G. Although that trauma got compounded through your life, particularly in these adult relationships you had with two women, one R and one J.
Right.
But that original abuse and trauma interrupted your emotional development.
When we talked about in the last season, this idea of personal agency, where I kind of gave over my personal agency, really take it even a step deeper than that. I gave up my emotional agency. So it didn't feel safe for me to express things with G, like anger and sadness and things like that. So I immediately just kind of started deferring to him. Just tell me what I was supposed to be feeling, more or less.
Right. So you felt unsafe to do any kind of emotional processing yourself. So you kind of outsourced that to him, which he, in fact, demanded and attempt to violently enforce. You were supposed to be feeling the same thing that he was feeling. For instance, the story you told about when he had lost his favorite toy, forcing you to bury your favorite toy.
To lose my favorite toy, basically. Yeah, right.
Yes, and if he was angry at someone, you had to be angry at someone. If he was happy about something, you were supposed to be happy about something. You were not really even supposed to be happy independent of him.
Yeah, that's true.
So if you came up with an idea or were finding pleasure in an activity that he wasn't involved with.
I believe we mentioned earlier that shame and fear kind of attach themselves, because those are kind of binding emotions. They attach themselves mostly to the negative, or what I saw as the bad emotions, anger, sadness, because I didn't want to experience those, because it was just it made me too afraid to experience those because I knew I couldn't act on them, more or less. But this kind of affected all of my emotions. So even my happy ones, since I always had this kind of lingering feeling of fear, it was like all my emotions were wrapped up in this one kind of messy ball. And so there were plenty of times where, I could experience pleasurable emotions and act on them and have a good day or whatever, but somehow this stuff was always kind of lurking there. And it was really easy for my brain to just kind of go down the wrong path. It didn't take much for it to enter dangerous territory. And then suddenly I'm triggered and there goes the pleasurable feelings, So hence this idea of big picture, it was just too hard for me to incorporate. Codependency is a spectrum. Mine went as deep as my emotions. So it wasn't just simply I felt the need to caretake these people. I felt the need to mirror them. I had to match their emotion.
I've read about the work of a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, who did some early work on the role that emotions play in decision-making. He challenges this traditional conception of decision-making as driven by our rational faculties. And he did that by studying people who had suffered traumatic brain injuries that essentially severed their emotional structures from their rational faculties, so that the rational part of their mind couldn't access their emotional architecture.
Couldn't incorporate the two, yeah.
So the theory would have been, well, these people are going to be great decision makers because they're unclouded by emotions.
Yeah.
And what it turned out is they were terrible decision makers. They couldn't, in fact, they were paralyzed
Yeah.
He describes, you know, one person is not even being able to make a decision about where to go for dinner. So highlighting how critical our emotional infrastructure is to making decisions about our lives.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, is part of what is so pernicious about emotional abuse that people don't recognize, is that it severs your connection to yourself.
I'm denying a huge chunk of what makes me me, more or less.
Yes, and you're denied it because you're made so that you cannot access that. And then, as you say, you can't have a big picture of your life. You can't. And this is some way was true of you. You couldn't really even make a decision where to go to dinner because unless someone was telling you,
it had
there was
to be
all
based
this
on
anxiety about what to do with your life, who to get a relationship with, what path to take, because you weren't able to access your own feelings, your own wants, and your own needs and your own desires, to do so.
Just kind of letting life kind of pull me around.
And unfortunately, the consequences of being denied this emotional agency, which I think is a nice term, is not only that it made it very difficult for you to find pleasure or satisfaction in your life on your own terms, it also, unfortunately, led to more shame.
Yeah.
Because you would often attach yourself to people, again, these disordered people who are more than happy to substitute their sense of reality, their sense of emotional truth for your own. And they were kind of shitty people.
Yeah, right. My emotions were there too. My emotions were giving me signals constantly, but they just came out in the form of things like shame or depression or anxiety and things like that. And I didn't want to feel those things. So
so you would cut those signals off at the pass. It's like, oh, I'm feeling shame being attached to this person or doing this activity, but I can't handle shame. I can't feel shame, so I can't receive that.
And
signal.
Then explode that out to things like anger and things like that. So like these people are abusing me, but I can't feel anger for it because that makes me feel shame and fear.
So you needed to reconnect those parts of yourself, your kind of conscious self and your emotional substructure.
Yeah, unbury it, sort of uncloud it.
And we kind of divided that process up for you into 3 sections. The first one being that you needed to build your capacity to at least feel them.
Yes.
And we had a whole episode on shame in the first season.
Yeah, how crippling it is.
How painful it is. Yes. So that was a big one. You need to build some capacity to be able to feel shame and it not be completely debilitating. So
and move through it.
Such that you just immediately compartmentalize it.
Yeah, and when I think about shame, for me, I know there's a lot of imagery that people have about it. Thoughts of I'm not good enough or I'm not lovable and things like that. I think that can be accurate for some people. For me, it wasn't that conscious. Like I wasn't having these thoughts, so I'm not good enough and things like that. It was more like a just below the surface subconscious feeling of shame. But it was right there. It was right there ready to go at any moment, and it was very easily triggered, but mostly by other people, either by abuse, but not even abuse. Just it would just get triggered because it was right there, ready to go. I mean, and it was very thick and very heavy.
So even when you started to feel safe in our relationship, your shame was still being triggered.
Yeah. Because I hadn't done any work yet. Like I hadn't figured any of this stuff out. I hadn't healed from my trauma. I didn't even know about my trauma, really. So yeah, conversations we would have would just easily trigger this shame. And then I would go into freeze mode. And then what would happen in freeze mode in our situation was just really confusing and sometimes crappy behavior and shame venting and the type of stuff we talked about in the shame episode.
Or sometimes it would literally look like you were frozen.
Yeah, right.
So we would be having a conversation that I would recognize was difficult.
Yeah.
You know, an intimate conversation about either our relationship, something happened in it, or, you know, your previous relationships, me trying to understand what those were about. And you would freeze.
Yeah, right.
I mean, physically.
Yes. I mean, I'll describe a little bit what that feels like for someone, because I've described it to you before, and you're like, oh, I don't think I've felt that before. So this is, for me, what freeze felt like. It would be this overwhelming buildup of undirected thoughts. I'm bringing in the past. I'm bringing in the future. Like I can't sort this all out.
Trying to manage the present.
It's like a cognitive dissonance overload. Basically, my brain reaches this kind of overload point and then shuts down. And now I'm just kind of mostly all I can do is just stare. I'm like staring at the ground or something. And I'm not. I want to think so badly. So, oh my God, I got to say something. I got to say something here, but I can't. And I can barely even think I want to say something here. It's just like static. It's like a TV that has been disconnected, and that's kind of how it feels and sounds in my head.
The term flooding too, you hear about. You're just kind of being emotionally flooded. You're just overwhelmed, and so you shut down.
Yeah.
I didn't really, took me a long time. I didn't really know what was going on. It just seemed to me.
Neither did I.
Yeah, I know. It seemed to me you kind of just like checking out, but I totally remember your freeze face.
Yeah, right. Right.
I see it very rarely.
Like kind of like a just kind of scared look on my face a little bit, right? Yeah, just like kind of staring with wide eyes or something. Yeah. The difference though with this freeze experience that I had with you was that at my core, I felt safe. Even though I didn't know this was what I was experiencing, freeze, shame, all this stuff, trauma triggers, I felt safe. And so it felt like I was where I needed to be with the person I needed to be with. Like, so this is uncomfortable. This is making me feel really crappy, but it's okay. Like, I need to feel this for some reason. I feel like this is necessary because what you're saying is correct, and these are things that I would like to know about.
So you did start to sit with it.
Yeah.
Not deflect, not actually run away.
I mean, it wasn't always perfect with that. There were times where freeze generated a terrible response, but it took a lot of practice, basically. Like, I knew that I needed to sit with this. There were several occasions where I was like, no, what I need to do is just like empathize. I need to sit here. I need to listen to what you're saying and
to the extent that you could. This. Right.
Yeah.
So that was I think the kind of capacity building where you just started.
Yeah.
Even though you were flooded or overwhelmed or frozen, all of these physical metaphors, you sat with it enough to begin to thaw out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if it's flooding, you got back up on your feet. You just you didn't let yourself completely get swept away by this. And then as you did that repeatedly, you seemed to start to build the capacity to handle that feeling.
Again and again, I came out on the other side of it. Okay. Not only okay though, usually it led to something. It led to something good, like some kind of realization, some kind of growth. There was always this kind of almost measurable progress each time I did sit through one of those kind of experiences. And it helped us in our relationship too. Absolutely.
And we eventually got in this rhythm of really kind of daily reflections and conversations.
I mean, that was really tough for me for a long time. I really like to write. I like to process things. I'll talk about this more in the rewriting stories, which is the next episode. But I really like to sit and write when I think about this stuff. Because all of this is forensic for me. Like, I have to go back and re-experience things, re-experience my emotions, reconnect things. And so for me, writing makes that easier. So I'd be writing, but a lot of times I'd almost a little kind of hide behind the writing a little bit. It's like, well, you want to talk about that? Well, let me just finish writing about it first, and then you can read what I wrote or something,
Right.
So it was hard for me to bring up conversations just because I could sense that I was going to feel shame again because and that I didn't want to feel that.
It's a terrible feeling. Yeah.
At the same time, it's like, well, no, we have to do this. I have to be able to do this.
That's the capacity building, and it is hard to do the thing that makes you scared and gives you pain. But you kept hanging in there, and there was measurable progress. And one story that demonstrates that progress is what we call
the headdress incident.
So why don't we tell that story, not to shame you,
sure,
but to demonstrate how that work that you did in building your capacity to feel painful emotions, mainly shame, actually paid off.
Yeah. Okay.
Over time. And you had a lot of shame for things that you didn't need to feel shamed about. We've mentioned a number of times how being the recipient of abuse can cause shame.
Yeah.
That's not shame that's appropriate.
Right. Yeah.
That's not shame that's
feeling.
Useful.
Yeah.
That's not shame that's actually connected to the real world. The headdress incident, unfortunately, does involve shameful behavior on your part. Appropriate shame. So I think it's a good example in that way, is because we do need to be able to feel shame.
Yeah.
So how it came up was you told me about this incident a number of times. Looking back, it seems like you were shame venting.
Yes, for sure.
But you brought it up a number of times, and the way you brought it up was, and I don't remember the particular contexts in which it came up, but you brought it up how you and Jay went to a 4th of July party and wore Native American headdresses, thinking that you were expressing respect for the original Americans, I think as you called it.
Right.
And that afterwards, some guy kind of ripped into you guys and
On Facebook.
And it made you feel super bad. And it's like, that's shitty. I don't like, people looking to catch people out in making a mistake. If you made an honest mistake, why are you being kind of publicly called out on it? But, again, it came up a number of times.
Yeah, I kept venting it.
You kept venting it. So eventually I was like, I wonder what's actually going on with this. And I went and I saw the pictures. Yeah. There were some pictures of the two of you. And the next time we got together, I told you that I had seen these pictures. I don't think you even knew that they existed, or you had buried it.
I think I buried the memory that they existed. Yeah.
I think I started the conversation by saying they're bad. Mm-hmm. Like if you ever wanted to run for office, these would really be a problem. Yeah. And because the pictures were not of people who mistakenly wore a respectful Native American hairdress, not knowing that was actually offensive to Native Americans. The picture was the two of you dressed up like Indians.
Yeah, right.
I mean, even without the headdress, it was totally disrespectful.
Yeah, well, and it like mixed other really lame elements with it too that had nothing to do.
Right. So the headdresses looked like you bought them from the dollar store. Yeah. Jay was wearing these little British underwear, hot pants, and she had face paint on, and I think maybe both of you had little like ribbons around your arms or something. Jay in particular looked like a clown. There was no way that this looked like
respectable.
Oh, it was,
an attempt.
A respectful attempt to honor Native Americans. It looked like a narcissist. Yeah. Wanting to make a point about how cool she is. Oh, you were all celebrating the 4th of July, but, the Indians were here first, but knowing nothing about Native American culture. And
there was also, we wore signs on our back, taped to our back, that said, honor Native treaty rights.
Right. And
as if it was kind of...
Neither of you could name a treaty.
Right.
That was made with the
and neither one of us actually did anything for this cause.
Yeah, so it was a bad picture.
It's awful.
And I was expressing this to you, and you started by, it was Jay's idea. I didn't really want to go along with it, but
the old lack of agency deflection that I did. Yeah,
and I pushed through that is because you're right there in color photo. Yeah. And because it was also, you weren't recognizing what a hurtful thing that was. You were just like, oh, well, Jay did it. I wasn't even into it. And looking back again, you were getting your freeze face on.
Yeah.
And, I was trying to do both. I was trying to reassure you. I'm not saying you're a terrible person, which is the shame response, right? I wasn't trying to cast you out of society. I was just wanted some acknowledgement that what you did.
Yeah. Do you understand
why it's so hurtful? And you also tried to say, well, the guy that called us out, he wasn't even Native American. And I was trying not to do the whole cancel culture. You're a terrible person because you did this one terrible thing. Yeah. But also trying to get from you some recognition of you understood why this was bad. Yeah. But you were flooded or frozen.
I was having a really hard time with that. Because, I was feeling shame. I was like, yes, this is right.
In fact, I remember you saying, I don't know what to do with these feelings.
Yeah. Yep.
Do you remember that?
Uh-huh. I do remember that.
So, but then we went into a social situation and you, I guess, did what you would always do is you compartmentalized it and it went in a box and it didn't come up again. Yeah. Until a couple months later, I think I was reminded of it by something I read online. And I was starting to feel a little bit bad that I hadn't pushed a little more for some sort of acknowledgement from you that this was hurtful and racist behavior.
Well, I didn't really do work in those earlier days, right? So we'd have a conversation and I'd be like, I'd like it if you spend some time thinking about this. And as soon as we went our separate ways, no.
Compartment. Put it in the compartment.
I'm not going to.
And, so, and I was kind of actually starting to feel a little bit ashamed myself, thinking like, well, how would I feel if my friends saw this and they'd be, how are you going out with this guy who acts like this? And then And then so I was like, and how did he not only do this, but be married to someone? So I called you up and said, I'd like to have a further conversation about this.
Yeah.
And then I went and read the Facebook
The
posts that you were,
exchange.
and those were terrible.
Very terrible.
Those are very terrible. So the person that you had described as kind of ripping into you
Shaming
and Jay,
us or something, yeah.
right? His post was perfectly reasonable.
very
it was
respectful,
Yeah, it was
actually.
just kind of, hey, it was to the venue. Can you let people know that this is not okay and that it's offensive? And of course, then you got the regular pilers on. Oh, how can you be offended?
Yeah.
But problematically, one of those people was Jay.
Yeah.
So
she immediately went
Jay,
right into defending herself and defending us.
Absolutely. And with terrible languages, which I have to read because it's so bad.
Well, we did mention this in the first season where she had this weird online presence where she was constantly battling with people.
Right,
And then she
yes.
probably wound up blocking every single person on this thread.
Probably.
No doubt.
So she says, "Dear all Native Americans," as if they're all the same, right? Like she's just going to address them as a block. "As I understand it, it is offensive to some of you when the white man tries to dress in your traditional clothing and headdress. However, you're wrong." She's going to say why they're wrong to be offended. "Today, an event calls for us to dress in our best American spirit. I can't think of a better way to honor you, the original American, the Native American, and dress as my best American spirit. My intentions are out of compassion, love, and respect, and I only hope everyone will see this." Of course, and not only I hope everyone, I demand that everyone recognize how people didn't, or and it wasn't terrible still, but people are saying, didn't matter your intent.
Yeah,
This is offensive, and by the way, we're not original Americans.
Right. America, it was not a thing.
America was not a thing. Anyway, so this doesn't make her happy, obviously, that she doesn't get validated.
She ratchets it up.
So she ratchets it up, and she also says, adding the fact that my boyfriend, unfortunately you, is part Cherokee.
Yeah.
Which you are not.
Well, this is something that I thought I discovered from my genealogy research, and I had told her that at some point. And
Yeah,
so
I'm not saying that you don't, somewhere in your background, you don't have an ancestor who's a Cherokee, but you are not part Cherokee.
No. And that doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, right. And she says, and my third great grandmother is Choctaw. So is it again? So people not tolerating that. So then she goes into, "I'm a 43 years old with a history of defending those in the minority. Those that are going to be offended will be offended. I know dressing the way we did, whilst supporting land treaty rights, was out of compassion and love. To those who see any different, okay, your mind won't be changed. I wonder how people will dress for the upcoming tiki party." And then she's like, "I'm checking out. People are. I'm done. Doesn't matter what obviously people just want to be offended, even though clearly I'm a 43-year-old white woman who." So there was that terrible thing.
Right.
And then all the way down, almost at the very end, you weighed in.
I finally weighed in, and mine was awful too. So what I was experiencing throughout this day, right, was all the stuff we explained about trauma bonding and stuff like that. Part of me already didn't like this situation. I didn't really like the way she was responding on this forum, but I was doing all the mental gymnastics I needed to do to make that okay and to align myself with her still. If she's against this language and if she wants to defend it, I need to too. So that's what was going on in my brain. And we talked about this in the first season. We just alluded to the fact that there were times when these people, J and R, abused other people and I participated. This is an example. This is an example where I participated. So finally I was just like, okay. And I weighed in and said some really offensive things. Like, it basically made it clear that I was on her side more or less, and that we didn't mean it. This was...
Well, you didn't actually take responsibility at all. Like, at least she's the one... You pretended you were just weighing into this as a neutral party.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even say it was me.
Right. You were just kind of like, I can see both sides sort of things. And, and
well, I said both sides are being offensive here or something.
Right.
Like
and you put white people in quotes as if you... I know it was bad.
It was bad. Right.
So by the time we got together to have this conversation, I was pretty upset and angry and wanting answers to, and this might have been a time where it might have been easier to work through this with a therapist
Yeah,
rather than
right.
with someone, because
Yeah.
I had the emotional investment. And the question was, who am I in a relationship with? Am I in a relationship with this type of person who would be married to this type of person? I was having my own cognitive dissonance because I had my own understanding of you, and this did not fit.
Yeah.
And your relationship with Jay, even though we had conversations, did not fit. The Jay was
Didn't make
this
sense.
person in your life.
Yeah.
Did not make sense with.
And I couldn't explain it either.
Right.
And that this is the problem. So we'd have these discussions, and I'd go into freeze modes because I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling shame. I know this was bad, but I don't know. I don't know why I was there. I didn't know about these things.
And I don't know how to manage this emotion or what to do with it.
Right.
But there's a silver lining to this whole story.
Right.
So how did you?
Well, so I had the day after this conversation, I had a full day of just severe shame. I was just feeling really crappy. But I remember saying, I need to feel this, like this is appropriate. Even though I didn't know it was shame. I didn't have any of this language we're talking about here on how important it is to feel and process and emotions and things. But part of me felt that I need to feel this. And then
it was appropriate. It wasn't.
It was appropriate.
And you understood
at
least why you were feeling it.
Yeah.
You understood it was because of this behavior.
Yeah. And so I started taking some time and writing, as I said, writing down. I went and pasted a bunch of the comments from the forum and things like that and from the exchange. But like I said, people were posting links. Here's a good write-up about why this is offensive. It was great. There was a lot. I read all that material, and by the end I did my own write-up to myself of, yes, wow, this is how I wish I had responded to it at the time, because this is the whole point of when people do call out this kind of thing. The person, the offender, the hope is they go, oh my God, you're right. Yeah, that was terrible.
It doesn't represent who I am.
Yeah, that doesn't line up with my values. You're right. I apologize. I vow to myself to not practice that behavior again. Like that's kind of, it doesn't take much, like to just show that, yes, I understand, you're right. It's like making an amends. So I felt like I still needed to do one more little thing. At that point, it happened 5 years ago. It was a very old thread, but it still existed. First thing I did was remove my old comment. And then I wrote a new one and put it on there, and thinking maybe it would ping a couple of people that were on the thread. Just is basically responding the way I wish I had responded at the time. And
which is just what you said, that they were right.
Yeah.
It didn't represent who you were, that you felt bad that they had to experience it. And then that.
And I appreciated that they did what they did, that they
took the time.
Yeah, because that takes a lot of guts to do that publicly, to call people
to say
out like
that this was hurtful behavior.
Yeah,
and
because there's a lot of people that shame people that do that. And there clearly were on this thread. One person said, I'm offended that you're offended, and stuff like that,
Right. Like if you
snowflake or something,
Exactly.
Like crap.
And that was scary for you to make that post.
Yeah, it was.
Remember.
Yeah. Yep. So it was like kind of the cherry on top of this, allowing myself to sit with and move through this feeling, know. And by the end, I felt like, okay, this felt like an appropriate way to process this.
And it still doesn't feel good. I mean, when we're
No,
talking
I
about
don't
now,
love thinking about
but you
it.
didn't. But you demonstrated there, I think, how far you had come. That you actually had done something shameful. It was public.
Yeah.
And you were able not just to feel it.
Yeah.
You were able to process it.
Yeah.
And move past it in a way that you didn't devastate you.
Yeah, I can't go back and change it, but now I fully understand it, and I can incorporate it.
There was this period of capacity building, which did result in you being much better at sitting with your emotions and at least feeling them and doing some processing of them.
Yeah.
But then the next phase became moving from capacity to understanding.
Yeah, and this took a little while. I mean, we had a good maybe year there of these kind of exchanges where it was on this spectrum of shame all the way up to freezes. I still had plenty of freeze moments, and I didn't understand what was going on. And one night, we're having one of these discussions, and I was having this freeze, and something finally clicked. I was like, wait a second, what's happening here? Like, why am I feeling? I actually tuned into what I was feeling, like what was going on in my body.
Right.
Like, I was like, oh, my chest is tight. Like, I'm sweating. I was having anxiety.
And this wouldn't have been an argument,
feeling.
or maybe not even a difficult conversation, but
right.
A conversation that's adjacent to
yeah.
potential shame.
Well, and so I moved very quickly through this process that I had never allowed myself to do before, which was first I acknowledged what was going on in my body. And I was like, oh, what is this? What am I feeling? Oh, I think it's anxiety. Like, why am I feeling anxiety? So this is not, I wasn't coming from a place of like learning what naming emotions was and recognizing trauma triggers and all that, but I stumbled into it and then just kind of accidentally did exactly that. I named my emotion. I looked for the source of it. Oh, it's because something made me feel crappy about myself. This conversation somehow made me think of something that it was hard for me to handle. Why is it making me feel that? Oh, because I'm ashamed of that behavior. I remember I don't like that I was that way.
Or in the past when someone asked me this type of question and they didn't get the right answer.
Oh, right.
I got
sure
abused and shamed.
Yeah, I mean, there were this exploded out.
Right.
Basically, this was my first realization of a trauma trigger.
Mm-hmm.
We had talked about trauma. We had known about trauma this whole year that we're talking about, but I didn't understand triggers. I didn't understand that I had them and what it meant and how it felt.
Right.
That it basically took me over and suddenly I'm in this different state of mind and it's guiding me.
And you're in a different place.
Yeah, different place. Now I'm back there. Right. And so when I had this realization, it went from conversations like this often ended with freeze, and then we had to kind of stop talking, and then maybe the next day we bring it up and recover from it, but it would take at least 24 hours to recover from it. This one we recovered that evening, that sitting, because I went, oh, well, am I actually experiencing what I'm feeling? Like, is this unsafe? Am I being attacked here? No, I'm not.
Yeah. What am I afraid of?
Yeah, what am I afraid of? I'm afraid of just remembering stuff. I'm afraid of experiencing something that isn't even happening right now. So that was the first instance of that. And once I did figure that out, suddenly I was like, wow, it put into place a lot of different things that I was writing about, because I was still at this point writing every day, and it like reframed a lot of things for me. And it gave me a new level of safety for conversations from there forward. And I still get triggered. I mean,
but you understand what's happening.
I understand what's happening. Like I know now exactly what it feels like, and sometimes it can be severe still too. It's going to happen, but I know what to do.
And that understanding freed you up from, as you say, staying in a frozen state for a long period of time, because you could understand that the emotions were not connected to that state.
Yeah.
But it also freed you up to feel like you had the right to your own emotions.
Yeah.
To not be always trying to mirror or check in with the other person to determine what you're feeling, because you could feel what you're feeling yourself and you could own that feeling.
I think this kind of muddled emotion ball that I mentioned earlier was still going. It was going all the way up until that happened, because I still had this shame and fear attached to stuff. Because I didn't know about that, and I had fear of conversations. I had fear of intimacy and being vulnerable, more or less, kind of.
And fear of not having the correct emotional response to someone else's emotions.
Right.
So, but once you understood that what was being triggered was past trauma and abuse, you were able to allow yourself slowly to feel your own emotions. So the one I'm thinking about most is anger.
Yeah.
Where you did not allow yourself to feel anger.
Yeah, the best I could do was turn it into resentment. I really did not feel safe expressing anger.
But you were able to start to recognize that you did not have to be afraid of your anger as well. Absolutely, you in the past were in situations where expressing anger was dangerous and could have gotten you even physically abused, but certainly verbally and emotionally attacked if you had expressed anger.
Right.
And it did. In fact, you did try to express anger, and that's what happened.
And it went badly, right.
It went badly, and it escalated. The other person became more violent.
Yeah.
You started to realize that suppressing your anger was a trauma trigger.
Yeah.
And then that you could be angry with me, at me. You haven't yet. We're working on that. But you could be angry at other people and express that anger.
Yeah, so there's a particular incident, what kind of like the story we just told about shame, that I feel is a pretty good example of latter days of me actually feeling anger coming on, sitting with it, identifying it, and figuring out that it was appropriate, and then responding to it. Like, so I went through this whole process with the feeling of anger, because a lot of times I could also remember up until this point having it start to bubble up, and then immediately feeling unsafe and pushing it down.
And this one came about from our conversations about the couples therapist that you went to with R. She's come up a couple of times because she's the one that in the initial session with the two of you, after you described R's behavior, said to R, "You're being abusive. It sounds like you're being abusive to him."
Right.
But then...
But shoving that under the rug.
Shoving it under the rug, and in fact... doing some pretty terrible things, validating R's story about you, that you just needed to be more masculine.
Right.
And that it was your fault.
Some of the things that she did and said almost kind of amounted to shaming in a way. When I look back and I recreate this, and I was like, wow, that was a terrible experience. It
was terrible. So, but you had not allowed yourself to feel that.
No. In fact, I rewrote the story.
She friended you on Facebook, the therapist.
I had a party and invited her to it.
Right. So
she came.
So you had left her a glowing review on Yelp, which was still out there.
Right. I had excused pretty much every step of that entire process. I had rewritten a new story for that entire process to where I felt fine about it. Not only fine about it, almost good about it. Like, yes, that was good. Oh yeah. She helped us she facilitate the end of the R relationship and all this stuff. Just like, what am I going to look, silver line am I going to look for here? You know? But finally we're having this discussion about it, and it's like, wow, no, that was not okay. This was not okay. That was not okay. This was actually a horribly irresponsible
and hurtful, right? Damaging.
Yes, it was
damaging therapeutic experience.
So yeah, I was starting to feel very angry about that, and it took me some false starts, and I had to really sit with it to allow myself to feel that, because I remember clearly gaslighting myself when I started to feel it, going like, oh no, I can't now. Here come the excuses again. No, I can't. No, I'm not justified in this. Doing this.
I'm not justified in that whole fear of being angry and maybe having to take action.
Yeah. Right.
So you worked through that.
Yeah.
That you were justified. When we worked through that together, again, it's helpful to have another person,
sure.
which was me in this case, saying like, no, that's not okay for a therapist to do that.
Right.
But then also the fear was still there, because then also came and so we started to talk about taking down the Yelp review and replacing it with a more honest one.
Yeah.
And you had all this fear. Well, what might she do? What could she do to me if I do that?
Yeah.
Like what kind of access does she have?
Well, this is the same exact thing that every other time, like when I was going through the divorce with Jay and stuff, like we'll maybe get into that in another episode, I'm sure. But yeah, just like what's going to happen? What are the repercussions of me expressing my emotion?
Right, because everyone is more powerful than you. Right?
Yeah, right.
So taking any kind of action against someone else that you see as more powerful is scary.
Yeah, so it's not like I'm sitting there, I don't have a right to express my emotion, but that's the effect, right? That's effectively what I'm doing. No, everybody else's experience is more important. I need to honor that no matter what it is. I'm not allowed to be angry.
But you worked through that as well.
Yeah, I worked through that, and I let it come back, and I said, I need to respond to this somehow. So yeah, what I wound up doing was, I didn't take down the review, but I went and did an updated review on that. So, you could still see the original and say like, I have to update my review here. And, didn't go into specifics.
And there was no name calling. There was no belittling of her.
Right.
It was just straightforward. I didn't have a good experience.
Yeah.
Here's
a few things that kind of generally what happened. And so I can no longer recommend this person, Yeah. Yeah.
It was a very mature expression of anger.
By the end of that, it felt good. It felt right.
You felt powerful in a good way.
Yeah. I didn't feel scared anymore. Once I put down, I was like, there we go. It's out. Ooh, okay. Kind of like this podcast in a way.
Right. Exactly.
Putting all this stuff out there.
So that's what kind of, again, building up capacity and then coming to this understanding of what was happening to you when it was happening. And now what you're working on, and this will take maybe the rest of your life.
Yeah, right.
is the mastery part.
Yeah.
Is right. As you're saying, that was kind of processing things that happened in the past, but now you're working on real-time processing.
Real-time processing. Yeah. And it's not always, I don't think it's easy for anyone really necessarily. We don't always know exactly what we're feeling right when we feel it. So I forgive myself for not being perfect at it, but I'm a lot better than I was. I think initially, once we had this realization that I was talking about with the recognizing the trauma triggers and the shame triggers, it started to immediately get better, but it was still like, okay, maybe 4 hours instead of 24 hours. But then it is in like, I'd still have a trigger. I kind of recognize that's what's happening, but I need to shut down still, and then later I'll process it or something. But it's becoming a lot more real time, and the more real time it gets, the less of these triggers I have. Just the safer I feel overall. It's safer not just with you, but safer with myself.
Right. Because you feel that sense of power over your own internal life.
I trust myself. I
You
trust
yourself.
my reactions to things, and that I have it right. That I'm recognizing the correct emotion.
And what are some of your tools that you're using to master this real-time processing?
I'm actually, a lot of times I find myself doing those steps that I talked about that I stumbled upon when we were talking about the realization of the trauma triggers, where I'm feeling an emotion. If it's an intense emotion, I go, okay, I'm feeling something intense coming on here, so I need to take a pause. What is it that I'm feeling?
To literally name it.
Yes, literally name it. Name what's going on in my body. Name what the emotion is. Try to separate it. So this happened recently. I just throw this out really quick, but I did this maybe a couple weeks ago, and I was feeling mostly embarrassment, some guilt, some remorse, and a tiny bit of shame. Mm-hmm. So it was like kind of specific,
that granularity,
yeah,
right.
And it was helpful for me to do that, because I was like, okay, what's the source of each of those? Like, what was causing each of these? Were any of those justified? Well, yes, in some cases they were. The little bit of shame was something that I don't think I fully processed yet. So what do I need to do to finish processing that? Things like that. So I move through the whole process and then respond. So if there is a response that needs to happen, then now I can take it from a position of like, well, okay, what actually happened here?
Right, and which emotion is motivating the response, which is what really emotions are for.
Yeah,
they're the part of us that motivates action.
Yeah, and so like you were saying with that story with the study, I mean, without that, it's just like I'm just mostly just making rationalizations, and that's what I did most of the time. It's just like, okay, I've already buried the emotions. Now what story can I write to make this okay? It's so easy at that point to compartmentalize.
And it becomes almost impossible to act.
Yeah.
Because you need some emotional content to your actions, whether you're motivated by anger or by fear or by guilt or by love. Otherwise, you're just kind of paralyzed.
Yeah. When you're making an action while you're still actually feeling the emotion, it's going to be a lot more sincere. And then the real time thing, I don't give myself a chance to rewrite the story, So if I don't let it get lodged somewhere beneath the surface and I have to write a story to get rid of it or something, like that's really hard to go back and change that. Like I've already screwed it up. But if I'm doing it real time, it's like, okay, I go through this process as quickly as possible before those things can happen. And the surprising and wonderful benefit that I've come to find is that the compartmentalization just went away.
Right. You don't need any compartments because you're not not stuffing anything into things.
So, this overwhelming thought of like, when we start talking about these maladaptive behaviors, like compartmentalization, it's like, oh crap, I have to work on that too. How am I going to get rid of compartmentalization? No, I didn't have to work on that. It's not as overwhelming necessarily as it sounds. Like certain things kind of take care of other things. So things like my depression too, just kind of resolved itself because I'm no longer this conflicted cognitive dissonance mess anymore.
We talked about the compartmentalization as a response to try to bring order to a chaotic emotional landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once the chaos diminishes, as it has so substantially, because you're able to recognize and name and act on the emotions as they happen, you don't need compartments anymore.
I feel
There's
safe
no
in
chaos.
my own head now. Yeah. So the compartmentalization was an answer to being unsafe in my head and not feeling as though I could trust myself and how I would react to things. Now that I'm able to incorporate my emotions into my life, it's like I'm a whole person now at this point. And the other awesome benefit is this big picture thing that I avoided because I pretty much had to, because it would always hit the fear wall constantly. Like I couldn't do 3 steps without hitting the fear wall. Now I'm able to think big picture. I can actually incorporate my personal values and things like that into my life. I don't have these lingering demons of things that I'm not doing because I feel powerless.
Being able to have a big picture view of your life is very empowering.
Yeah, definitely.
You just mentioned that when you were disconnected from your emotions, that the stories that you told yourself about your life were mostly just rationalizations. So the stories weren't about trying to understand your experience. They were about trying to distance yourself from shame and fear.
Yeah, right.
You would bury the emotions and then just rationalize away the whole situation.
Rewriting those stories has been another major effort that has moved me along in my healing path. So we were going to spend the next episode discussing roles the stories played in keeping me stuck in dysfunction and the role they played in helping me free myself from that dysfunction.
We hope you join us for that episode. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook by searching Codependent Mind.